This is the second in a series of talks on revitalizing manufacturing in America that was presented first at the Lansing Lions Club. I would like to thank my fellow Lions for sponsoring this presentation today. As always, I will begin with my standard disclaimer. The opinions in this talk are my own, and they do not necessarily reflect the opinions of any employer, past or present, or of anyone else. My objective today is to outline a strategy for restoring manufacturing in America. If you heard the first talk in the series, then you know at least 6 reasons why this is an important topic. That talk described 2 military dangers, 2 financial dangers, and 2 economic dangers that are faced by a nation that relies too much on other countries for its manufactured goods, and therefore imports a lot more than it exports. I will not summarize that talk today, except to say that I hope it convinced you that restoring manufacturing is absolutely essential to America's future. It is more than just a good idea. It is a matter of national survival. At the end of that talk, I laid out 4 criteria that should be met by a strategy for restoring manufacturing. First, it should steer America away from those 6 dangers. It might not end those dangers immediately and solve all of the nation's problems, but it should get America moving in the right direction. Second, it should be good for workers and for employers, for consumers and for shareholders, for retirees and for taxpayers, for America and for America's trading partners. I have tried hard to develop a strategy in which none of these groups will be worse off, and each of them will share in the important benefits of setting America on a safer and more sustainable economic course. Of course, it would be possible to make any one of these groups even better off by focusing exclusively on its needs while disregarding the interests of everyone else. But the strategy I will present today is intended to respect the interests of all of these groups. In addition to being good for just about everyone, the strategy should be equally acceptable to Democrats and Republicans. I am not a Democrat or a Republican myself. I sometimes describe myself as coming from the far middle of the political spectrum. My hope is that Democrats and Republicans will both find merit in the strategy that I will describe today, and see it as a reasonable compromise that accomplishes some very important objectives. Of course, that might not be enough. Some people from both parties might reject a proposal that comes from the far middle of the political spectrum. Some Democrats might reject it because of the parts that Republicans like. Some Republicans might reject it because of the parts that Democrats like. I never said that my strategy will be highly acceptable to both parties. I just said that it should be equally acceptable to both parties. One way or another, I hope to give both parties something that they can agree on. Finally, a strategy for revitalizing manufacturing should be painless. I have tried hard to devise a strategy in which costs are consistently and immediately outweighed by benefits. Medicine does not have to taste bad to be good. Getting the economy to work right will have a lot of benefits, so it should make us feel better instead of worse. I plan to speak for only 30 minutes in this talk, so I cannot address every aspect of this strategy. I will focus on describing what the strategy is and how it is intended to work. The nuts and bolts of how to get it to work that way, and how to get it implemented in the face of today's political realities, will be left for future presentations and for an eventual written version of this series. So some of you might leave today saying, that would be a good strategy if it worked, but I don't really see yet how it could work or how it could actually happen. If you leave saying that, then I will consider this talk a success. My goal for today is just to have you say, that would be a good strategy if there is a way to make it work. I also want you to come back for my next talk to get some details of how to make it work. So here is my strategy. One reason for the decline of industrial production in America is that American employers have a lot of overhead costs. In 2011, the overhead costs of American employers included $3,500 per worker for the employer share of Social Security and Medicare, $5,200 per worker for health insurance. Now, you may wonder where you can find health insurance for only $5,200. A lot of workers have no health insurance at all, and they bring down the average. Employers that actually do provide health coverage paid an average of about $11,000 per year on a total premium of over $15,000 per year. So to get a picture of how health costs affect employers that do offer health insurance, you can imagine this slice of the pie being 2 or 3 times as large as what you see in the slide. There was another $300 per worker for life insurance and disability insurance, $2,900 per worker for pensions and other retirement plans. Again, these figures are just averages. The amounts are much greater for employers that actually do offer life insurance and retirement plans. $900 per worker for workers' compensation, $500 per worker for unemployment insurance, and $4,000 per worker for the corporate income tax. That figure is for 2007. The figure for 2011 is not available yet, but it is probably lower than in 2007 due to slow recovery from the recession. Finally, there was a cost of $6,100 per worker for state and local business taxes. About half that figure is for state taxes and half for local taxes for the nation as a whole. That data is also from 2007. This adds up to over $23,000 per worker per year. Businesses can avoid these expenses by outsourcing production to other countries, or importing products from other countries, or moving their operations to other countries. So that is what they do. Likewise, consumers can avoid these expenses by purchasing foreign goods instead of domestically produced goods. So that is what consumers do. Getting out of paying America's overhead costs in those ways does not make the nation's needs any smaller. It just leaves more needs unmet and concentrates costs into that smaller and smaller proportion of transactions that involve goods and services produced by American workers. But what if it were possible to reduce these overhead costs from over $23,000 per worker per year to about $3,100 per worker per year? That would be a savings of over $20,000 per worker. The cost of doing business in America would be reduced by about $1.7 trillion per year for the private for-profit sector as a whole. I think that would go a long way toward making American labor competitive with foreign labor and improving America's balance of trade. This talk is about how to bring about that sort of reduction in employer overhead costs. Today I will focus primarily on the simplest elements of overhead costs, the employer payroll tax for Social Security and Medicare, and the corporate income tax. Healthcare costs will be dealt with in my next series of talks, and the other overhead costs will be addressed in the written version of this series. Now, you may have never heard the words simple and corporate income tax used in the same sentence before. The corporate income tax accounts for many thousands of pages of tax code and regulations and guidelines and court decisions. It is not a simple tax, and improving it would probably require several thousand more pages. So instead of improving it, I propose to eliminate it, along with the employer payroll tax for Social Security and Medicare. What makes it feasible to take these overhead costs away from employers is the fact that any costs paid by employers are ultimately passed on to consumers, workers, and owners. That is the key to understanding my strategy. Consumers bear these costs through higher prices. Workers bear them through lower wages. And shareholders and other owners bear them through lower profits. So what will happen when the payroll tax and the corporate income tax are eliminated? For starters, it will save businesses about $626 billion per year in direct costs. It will also eliminate a lot of compliance and enforcement costs. Escaping the complexity of the corporate income tax and its many thousands of pages of provisions and regulations might be a significant stimulus to the economy in itself, even apart from the taxes that businesses would no longer have to pay. Businesses could pass some of those savings on to consumers in the form of lower prices. They could pass some savings on to workers in the form of higher wages, and they would pass the remaining savings on to shareholders or other owners, or else retain some of the savings. Retained earnings also benefit the owners by making their company larger and wealthier and more valuable. This all leaves the government short by about $626 billion. So eliminating these overhead costs is only half of what is needed to make this strategy work. There is one more shoe that needs to drop. When these two taxes are eliminated, they can be replaced with new taxes, but in such a way that tax burdens and revenues are unchanged, so that the government breaks even. The money that consumers save through lower prices can be used to pay a new tax on consumers, such as a national sales tax or a value-added tax. This would not be an increase in the tax burden for consumers. My strategy calls for this new tax to just offset the savings that consumers experience due to reduced business overhead costs. In order for this new tax to be acceptable to the public, consumers need to have total confidence that it will not increase their cost of living and reduce their real incomes. There needs to be a simple and effective method for achieving that outcome. How can that be accomplished? How can the new tax be calibrated and adjusted so that it remains equal to consumer savings, even as those savings change over time as the new strategy is gradually implemented? And how can all this be done in a fail-safe manner so that consumers break even if the relevant economic estimates and projections turn out to be wrong? Well, that is beyond the scope of this talk. You need to come back next week to find out how the strategy can actually be implemented, and some aspects of this question will not be covered until the eventual written version of the series. For now, it is enough to say that my strategy calls for no added financial burden for consumers. Being able to guarantee this is probably the most critical requirement for implementing this strategy. Moving on now to workers. If overhead savings are passed on to workers in the form of higher wages, that would make it necessary to come up with a new tax to offset those wages. It would also work against the goal of reducing the cost of employing American workers. There is no point in reducing the cost of employing American workers through lower overhead costs, only to have the cost of employing workers come back up again through higher wages. So it would be better to have no direct impact on real wages and no new tax on income. How can that be accomplished in a manner that is simple and effective, and also flexible and feasible? That will also be addressed in an eventual written version of the strategy. The remaining savings would accrue to owners through higher profits. That would be a good thing, because such profits can provide some of the funds that businesses need to take advantage of new opportunities to reindustrialize America. Higher profits can be offset by new taxes on shareholders and other owners. What sort of tax can fall on owners without also having an adverse effect on businesses and workers and consumers? How can such a tax be designed so that it is simple and fair and painless? The answer to those questions is too interesting to wait for a future talk. In fact, it might be the most interesting thing that you hear today. So I will get to it in a few minutes after I flesh out the broad outlines of the overall strategy a little bit more. In some respects, the strategy that I have just described does not change very much at all. In other respects, it would be a very emphatic change for the better. Consumers break even, workers break even, and owners break even, as far as direct effects are concerned. That does not sound like much of a change. Yet this strategy would eliminate many of the current disincentives to employ workers in America and to purchase goods made in America. Many overhead costs would no longer be part of doing business in the U.S. Consider, for example, a product that can be made just as efficiently in the U.S. as abroad. At the present time, the American product is more expensive because of all the overhead costs that are built into its price. The proposed approach takes away that burden, which currently falls only on consumers of domestic goods, and replaces it with a consumption tax that falls on domestic and imported goods alike. That makes it possible for domestic and imported goods to compete on a more level playing field. Domestic goods become less expensive than before, while imported goods become more expensive than before. American consumers will then be paying America's overhead costs, regardless of whether they purchase domestic or imported goods. Disincentives for shareholders and other owners would be corrected as well. Again, consider a product that can be made just as efficiently in the U.S. as abroad. At the present time, shareholders bear a larger burden from overhead costs if the product is made in the U.S. Shareholders can therefore be better off if operations are moved offshore, or if profits are invested overseas, or if they invest in foreign firms instead of U.S. firms. The proposed approach takes away the burden that currently falls on owners of firms that employ a lot of American workers and make their profits on U.S. operations, and replaces it with a new tax that falls on American shareholders equally, regardless of whether their firms operate in the U.S. or not. Even though the direct effect of this strategy is that consumers, workers, and owners all break even, the indirect effects ensure that they all come out ahead. America would have more jobs, more profits, more factories, more exports, a more favorable balance of trade, less new debt, and less exposure to the 6 military, financial, and economic dangers that were described in the previous talk. I said earlier that the taxes on owners might be the most interesting portion of this talk, so now I will describe what the new taxes for shareholders might look like. Of course, not all business owners are shareholders. The written version of this talk will address sole proprietorships and partnerships and S corporations. But the new taxes for shareholders of publicly traded companies are interesting enough that I want to talk about them now. I tried to make these taxes as simple and painless as possible, and I came up with something pretty interesting. The taxes I have in mind are so simple that shareholders would generally not have to file any forms, or report any information, or even part with any money. What could be better than a tax that does not involve parting with any money? Moreover, as I have already said, these taxes would not represent an added burden for shareholders. My strategy calls for these taxes to be just equal to the overhead savings that are passed on to owners instead of consumers. If most of the savings are passed on to consumers, then the new taxes on owners will be much smaller than the new tax on consumers. The burden of these taxes would be no greater than the benefit that shareholders receive from businesses having lower overhead costs. What shareholdings would be subject to the new taxes? The new taxes would apply to all shares owned by residents of the U.S., regardless of whether operations are located in the U.S. or located in a foreign country. I see no good reason why Americans who invest their money in America should pay a larger share of the nation's overhead expenses than Americans who invest their money overseas. The new taxes would also apply to all operations conducted in the U.S., regardless of the location of the shareholder. Foreign shareholders already bear their share of American business taxes and healthcare premiums and other overhead costs, so this would not really be a change. The only shares not subject to the new taxes would be those owned by foreign shareholders, to the extent that they represent operations outside the U.S. The interesting question is, how would the new taxes work? For the sake of administrative simplicity and efficiency, the new taxes on shareholders would be paid by U.S. corporations and also by any foreign corporations that agree to participate. But they would be paid in such a way that the economic burden falls entirely upon shareholders, with no impact on the corporation's cash flow and no incentive to avoid taxes by moving operations overseas. These would be taxes on owners, not taxes on businesses. The only case where shareholders would have to report information and make cash payments is where U.S. residents own shares of foreign companies that do not make payments on their behalf. Corporations would make two types of payment to the government. First, a small fraction of dividends would be paid to the government instead of to shareholders. In other words, if reducing overhead costs makes dividends higher, then this tax on dividends would offset that. It would not matter whether the dividend is payable to someone in a high income tax bracket or a low income tax bracket, or whether it is payable to a U.S. resident or a foreign resident or even a foreign government. This portion of the tax would simply make the dividend a little bit lower. Thus, the burden of this tax would fall entirely on the shareholder, and the company would not have any less money than it would have in the absence of the tax. Corporations would also be required to create a certain number of new shares each year based on their total number of shares outstanding and the percentage of the company's operations in the U.S., and the percentage of the company's stock owned by U.S. residents, and a measure of the firm's profitability. These new shares would be transferred temporarily to the U.S. government. The government would then follow a standardized procedure to sell those shares so that it would end up with cash instead of an ownership stake in corporations. The critical feature of this tax is that it would not cost corporations anything, aside from printing some new stock certificates each year and keeping track of who ends up owning them. Even though the shares would come from the corporation and not from the shareholders, the economic burden would fall entirely upon the shareholders, since the value of their holdings would be diluted by a small amount. For example, someone who used to own 1,000 shares out of a bazillion shares total would now own 1,000 shares out of a little more than a bazillion shares. That would be a real cost for shareholders, but it would be as painless and invisible as the costs that they bear through stock options and derivatives and other practices that silently reduce investor returns. The aggregate burden of the new taxes for shareholders would be no greater than their benefit from reduced overhead costs. These new taxes would be much better for businesses and for shareholders than the overhead expenses that they replaced. Current overhead expenses increase the cost of doing business and reduce cash flow and make the company's products less competitive. Current overhead costs discourage conducting business in the United States and encourage outsourcing and moving operations overseas and sheltering profits overseas. The new taxes would not do any of these things. In fact, I would expect the value of American stocks to increase due to an improved business climate, despite the small amount of dilution of dividends and ownership shares that would occur. In summary, the strategy you have heard today would reduce the overhead costs of American firms by about $20,000 per worker per year. That would lead to lower prices for domestic goods, which would be offset by a new tax on consumers. The most important feature of that tax is that it would fall on imported and domestic goods alike. Thus, consumers would be supporting the Social Security system and covering America's other overhead expenses, regardless of whether they purchased domestic goods or imported goods. One of the keys to making this approach politically acceptable is ensuring that the new tax does not exceed the amount that consumers save through lower prices. The savings that are not passed on to consumers would benefit shareholders and other business owners. That would be offset by new taxes that fell on owners but not on businesses themselves. American business owners and shareholders would pay this tax, regardless of whether their firms do business in the U.S. or other countries. Thus, consumers would no longer avoid paying America's overhead costs when they purchase imported goods. That would give them less incentive to do so. Likewise, businesses and business owners would no longer avoid paying America's overhead costs when they outsource production or move operations to foreign countries. That would give them less incentive to do so. This would steer America away from the 6 military, financial, and economic dangers that were described in the previous talk. Would reducing employer costs by $20,000 per worker be enough to stop the flow of imports into the U.S.? Of course not. This strategy is not about eliminating imports. In fact, it is not necessarily even about reducing imports. If this strategy results in greater prosperity, it could even lead to more imports than the U.S. buys now. And it would certainly lead to more imports than the U.S. will buy if America's trade imbalance is allowed to continue until it leads to the sorts of economic collapse that were described in the first talk of this series. Buying more imports would not bother me, as long as exports increase enough to bring America's trade back into balance, and as long as America gets back into the business of running factories. That is how the strategy is supposed to work. You have probably noticed several obstacles to actually getting it to work that way. The next talk in this series will address one of those obstacles. The strategy described today requires tax rates to be established and adjusted in a precise and credible and timely fashion. Yet authority over taxes is vested in the legislative branch of the federal government, and the legislative branch cannot always even agree about whether or not America will pay its bills. How can fiscal policy be implemented with sufficient precision and credibility and timeliness? This strategy requires moving toward a more responsive and more responsible fiscal policy, and that needs to be done in a way that is politically feasible as well as technically feasible. So the title of the next talk is Moving Toward a More Responsive and More Responsible National Fiscal Policy. I should warn you that this title is somewhat misleading. It might give the impression that the next talk will be somewhat dry and technical. But I have tried to make each talk in this series more interesting than the one before. Like any medicine, the approach to fiscal policy that I will describe in the next talk has some side effects. And those side effects are what make the next talk interesting. They include lower unemployment and better control of inflation. Since this talk is being presented in Michigan, you may be interested in knowing that another side effect is reducing the tendency for Michigan to have worse recessions than the rest of the nation. Another important side effect that the whole nation will be interested in is reducing the burden of the national debt. If those topics are of interest to you, then I invite you to be here for the next talk of this series.